Hello and welcome to the podcast BFI Talks, which is brought to you by Prague Finance Institute, an affiliate of the leading Czech economics research center Sergej EI. It is my pleasure to welcome Dan McCrum, a Financial Times journalist and writer who uncovered one of Europe's biggest modern-era accounting fraud, which brought down payments processing company Wirecard, which had been lauded as Germany's PayPal until its collapse in June 2020. Hello, Dan.
Hello, and thank you for having me on.
Can we do, because I'm a former journalist, you're still a journalist and a writer, and thank you for providing me with this reading material. Your book is amazing. Just show it to
Money Men in shops now.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Money Man. And as we speak, as we're recording this on February the 13th, the trial of whoever is actually still left in Germany of the top senior management of Wirecard is standing for trial. And today is the first time that the former CEO, Markus Braun, has testified. I mean, he keeps, at least given the reports, we could see it up until this moment, he keeps denying any knowledge of documents being forged or any fraudulent behavior regarding accounting of what's actually still known as the missing almost 2 billion euros, which apparently never existed. And you very well described it in the book that it might have not actually really existed because there just wasn't any business to back it. What do you think of this latest twist and turn? Because you've been following it for what, 7, 8, 9 years?
I mean, 2014 was when I started. So what's that now? It's almost coming up for 9 years this summer. So, wow. And, did I ever really expect to see the chief exec behind bars? There were definitely moments when I didn't. And now he's on trial. It's completely fascinating because he's actually testifying in his defense. The case must be going badly enough that he feels compelled to put his side of the story. And there's a guy who has written a terrific book about frauds of all kinds called Lying for Money, Dan Davies. And it's that he addresses this question directly about why is it so hard to prosecute criminal fraud? Because, there's an awful lot of financial fraud out there and very few successful prosecutions. And people often say, these are very complex cases to prosecute. But actually, the truth of it is, the finance is a little bit complicated. But what makes it so hard is to work out who are the people who are lying. Because you get into court and everyone blames each other. And this is exactly what's happened in Wirecard. The main guy, Jan Marsalek, I'm sure we'll get onto him. Completely fascinating character. Basically, by day, senior executive at a German financial institution. By night, a wannabe spy, James Bond-like figure and master criminal. So he's disappeared. He's off hiding in Russia somewhere.
Do we know for sure that he's in Russia? Because
all the
evidence
books that points in that direction.
Yeah, okay.
All the evidence points to Jan being in Russia. And so we're left with this trial of the former chief executive, Markus Braun, the deputy CFO, who we don't need to get too concerned with him. He's admitted to forging some documents and he's in a lot of hot water. And then you have this guy called Oliver Bellenhaus, who was one of the chief lieutenants who was actually running the fraudulent business on a day-to-day.
And he was in day-to-day contact with Jan Marsalek and mostly over Telegram. So there's actually no evidence, the Telegram, the encrypted Telegram app, which means that there's probably no paper evidence the court can actually look at now. So it is really word against the word, isn't it?
There's an awful lot of paper evidence for how the fraud happened and, that it didn't make any sense. And you can see that this construct was put in place to deceive auditors, investors, and various other people. Mm-hmm. But they don't have the smoking gun of Marcus Brown telling the other people to go and commit fraud. Please make these numbers up. Do something illegal. If that was done, it was all done on Telegram. And all the Telegram chats pretty much were deleted pretty soon after the company collapsed. So you have one of the bad guys is cooperating and is testifying against his former boss. And he says, this guy told us to do it. He was the one in charge. He was the one making the decisions. And there's an awful lot of circumstantial evidence.
And that's Oliver Bellenhaus. That's the cooperating witness.
Yeah, so Oliver Bellenhaus is the sort of drives like a maniac racing driver and was living in the world's tallest building in Dubai, where he sort of single-handedly ran Wirecard's largest business.
And in your book, you are referring to a quote of his to a colleague describing all these sort of like Potemkin sort of village type of companies as like monkeys in suits that, I mean, he must have been aware of that it just didn't exist.
He knew for sure. And he's said quite clearly in the trial, in fact, that the structure which Wirecard came up with and persuaded its auditors existed didn't make any sense. You know, you just wouldn't run a payments company like that. But because all of it was quite complicated and required a lot of technical expertise, they sort of seemed to convince people that that's how they had done it for strange historical reasons and because it was so profitable. And, you know, the broader point here is you can sort of hide a lot in complexity. You see this time and again in finance, don't you? When people lose large amounts of money, it's quite often because they're investing in something they didn't really understand.
But I mean, what it seems now with the hindsight, it was in the broad daylight stock market's Ponzi scheme, because the company wasn't really actually making much money, if at all, but was still being able to cook the books enough to persuade everyone around, and as you say, hide in complexity, that they are so profitable that they keep growing, their EBITDA is growing, and profits and everything. And they were just like obsessed with delivering that news to their investors, shareholders, and the stock price, share price kept rising.
So Wirecard sort of have elements of lots of different criminal stories that we see elsewhere. It becomes this amazing story in part because they all get wrapped up into this one thing, which gets bigger and bigger. So it starts out with elements of money laundering. They're a payments company and they're helping to wash money for some disreputable businesses online, particularly online gambling in places where you're not allowed to do it. And the thing I always say is, if they go unpunished, small crimes become big crimes. Mm-hmm. And so over time, the business morphs. You know, the money laundering isn't really as good as it used to be. And to make up the difference, they start cooking the books. You know, we just need to hit this quarter's numbers, or we can't disappoint. We still need to show growth this year. So they fake it a little bit. And then the next year, well, we're still behind. We need to fake it a little bit more. And it gets bigger and bigger. And eventually, the accounting fraud just takes over. It is the entire business. And what you're doing at that point is you just have to keep the plate spinning. Because if everything stops, it all collapses. Because you make the numbers look good, and that allows you to go and raise money from investors, take out big loans from banks, and then you fund it all, and then you keep it going, and it sort of takes on a life of its own.
But do you think that because when actually the predecessor of Wirecard, we may go into the original name of the company, but when it became Wirecard and a listed company, it was really coinciding with the long era of very easy money, low interest rates, and maybe it would have just collapsed by itself by now, because, I mean, people are sort of like looking down on tech companies. But how could have they cooked the books for so long without any support from their auditors? I know it's another big $1 million question, I suppose. How much Ernst & Young Germany were involved in covering up the fraud, knowingly or unknowingly.
So there's a lot of blame to go around. You can't have a 20 billion euro accounting fraud without quite a few people not doing their jobs properly. So the regulators were blind. They didn't regulate Wirecard properly. And when people like me in the press started to write nasty things about the company, they rallied to Wirecard's defense and started investigating its critics on multiple occasions. The bankers and investors should have known better. It's not like the problems at Wirecard came out of nowhere. Over time, there were always these rumblings about the company. Mm-hmm. It had a certain reputation in the industry. If you had what's known as high-risk payments, things like pornography, gambling, you would go to Wirecard. And so a lot of people assumed, rightly or wrongly, that, well, it's probably doing all sorts of nasty business, and maybe that's why it's so profitable. Maybe that's why it doesn't want to talk about the details of exactly how it makes so much money. So I think that was kind of an excuse which a lot of investors swallowed, if they thought about it that hard. If you have a big portfolio of stocks, payments is great. Tech is great. The numbers seem to be quite good. Do I need to think about it more deeply? I'll just buy. But there were critical voices and they were ignored for a long time. So let's not let, investors and the banks who lent Wirecard more than 3 billion euros off the hook as well. But then you do come ultimately to the auditors. Ernst & Young signed off on the books every year for a decade.
Yeah.
And they were at best horrendously negligent.
Because they were ready to sign off, give an all clear sign to their last audit after going to see the trustee in Manila and going to these, ramshackle sort of branches of two banks where they were giving envelope with some documents proving that apparently there's that money in those two bank accounts, which is so vividly described in your book. And it was only the audit of the auditors by KPMG that actually forced them to send the letter, which I would have done as a journalist, just like go to the higher ups, ask the Philippine Central Bank or the regulator whether that's all real or not.
Okay, I think we might need to step back and fill in some of the detail there for the listener, because what happened was, towards the end, Wirecard was really under pressure. So it says, okay, nobody trusts Ernst & Young or our accounts anymore because of what's been written by the Financial Times. So we will conduct a special audit. We'll call in KPMG and they'll go over everything. And let me give you two examples of what I think was going on there, based on sort of what people who were in the room at different times told me about it. So this special audit starts, and they begin to have meetings with KPMG, Ernst & Young, loads of people from Wirecard. And KPMG are real sticklers for the details. They've been brought in basically to do a forensic audit, and they want to see every single piece of paperwork. Did you buy a stapler? Great. Where's the receipt? That sort of thing. But in these meetings, I'm told that the auditors from Ernst & Young, who have been there a long time, sort of stood up and did this little speech where they're like, we get it. Wirecard's a fast-growing company. It's basically still got this startup mentality, and it's growing so quickly, it hasn't had a chance to put proper procedures in place, that sort of thing. And we understand that. We're happy to work with it. We realize you have to have a certain flexibility and ability to really get to grips with what's going on here. And there were people in the room from Wirecard who were sort of looking at Ernst & Young at this point going, I've got doubts about the business. Like, what on earth is going over there that they have this magic money-making machine that only needs a handful of people to run it? One of the Wirecard people, he said, if they can make that much money with 6 people, what are the other 6,000 of us here for? So even at that stage, people were sort of scratching their heads going, what's that EY are smoking? Mm-hmm. But so the process is all very complicated and they've got to verify everything. But it comes down to this central question of where's the money? And it turns out Wirecard's whole excuse is there's a lawyer looking after it. Well, we better meet this lawyer then. Oh, okay, great. We all need to fly to the Philippines. So this team of German lawyers and accountants fly to the Philippines to meet the lawyer. And they go to his penthouse office in the Philippines. And when they walk in, pretty much the first thing they see is his YouTube studio. And he has one of those plaques, for 100,000 subscribers. And if you go to his channel, he gives advice about divorce and family law, that sort of thing. And so the people in the room are kind of thinking, this is the guy who's looking after 2 billion euros of this German bank's money. And, like you mentioned, it gets even crazier, and they have a police escort to go and visit a couple of bank branches. But, they're not going to the headquarters in the financial district. They turn up on some little fairly quiet road with lots of stray dogs running around and, a bicycle repair shop next door. It's that sort of scene. And that's the bank branch where you keep all of this German financial institution's money. And the lawyer's like, it's very convenient for me in the morning. We
should actually add, for the benefit of our listeners, that Wirecard is a regulated bank in Germany. It is a banking institution and a payments processing, or was a payments processing company as well.
Exactly. None of it made any sense whatsoever. But one thing someone involved did say to me was it had taken so long to get to that point. The process had been so painful to get any detail, any information whatsoever, that there was a sense of relief that there was something happening. There was a guy. He had a piece of paper. And on that piece of paper, it said, oh, look, there's an extremely large amount of money in some accounts at this bank. Now, as it would turn out, that piece of paper was not a real document. And when they finally discovered that, the entire thing comes crashing down. But that's kind of the crazy thing in all of this. This huge edifice, this giant international company, all of this intrigue over many months. And it comes to, they get on a plane, go and visit someone, and he hands them a piece of paper. And that's it.
That's really actually one of my central questions, and there's a lot of them. I mean, the more you dive into it, the less you sort of like comprehend, because it has boiled down to these lawyers flying to Manila, and we should say they actually did it despite COVID has just started raging at that time, and impacting the whole world and travel and everything. But you and your colleague, I mean, especially your colleague from Singapore, I mean, actually went to all these places even years before then, and nothing had happened,
I mean, some of the great stories are when we actually go and knock on doors, and the sort of things you find, you're looking for businesses which just aren't really there. And I mean, one of my favorite scenes in the whole story is we have started to realize what the essence of Wirecard's business is. Its deep, dark secret that it hasn't really told anyone is that most of its business is conducted through 3 business partners. And it sort of fits with that money laundering explanation. So they tell people inside the company that any business that's too hot to handle, we send it to our friend. There are 3 of them. There's one in the Philippines, one in Singapore, one in Dubai. And these guys process the dodgy payments for us. And they send us back a nice commission, and our name is not involved. And that works for a very long time. But by the time we get to knocking on the doors to try and work out what's going on, we've realized this accounts for half of the entire business, pretty much all of their profits. And the very first tip I was given about Wirecard was this question from a hedge fund guy. Would I be interested in some German gangsters? And so when we're getting ready to go and knock on the door of one of these partners, we're a bit worried. Is this the gangsters that we're finally going to find? Is this, quite a dangerous secret at the heart of it? So we send my colleague Stefania Palmer off to the address she's got a fixer with her and a photographer. We're not sending her alone. And we're not really sure what she's going to find. So she goes to this address, and it's a couple of hours drive outside Manila. And she comes to a residential villa, knocks on the door, and it opens up into a courtyard. And the first thing she sees is a couple of guys with a Pomeranian, a little dog, on a table, and they're giving it a haircut. And there is no sign of international payment processing going on anywhere. And that was the first real moment where I think we were convinced there's nothing there. This is an entire house of cards.
Yeah, it is an entire house of cards and now being discussed by the German court. But let's go back a little in terms of you getting involved as a journalist, because you were given a lot of support from the Financial Times to be doing it for so long. What was key for you as a journalist at the time to actually get that support and being able to work on that story? And will you still be able to get support to do another big story like that, or or is this what's expected from you now?
Well, I think I've got some good stories coming. I think key, in any job, not just journalism, is having the trust of your boss. If you want to write difficult stories, you need your editor to trust you. And so I was very lucky that throughout all of this, I had this brilliant old school editor, very experienced hack, been in business journalism for a very long time, and also was someone who likes to push the boundaries. Paul Murphy, and he's got a bit of the punk rock spirit about him. Wears this little silver sort of skull and crossbones ring on his little finger, which one of his teenage daughters made. With his business suit, of course, he's always looked very smart at the same time. Just to give you a sense of this character, and he was always just follow your nose. Right back at the beginning when I'm trying to decide what is this story I've got here, what's going on, and he simply says, well, pick one of these companies and just fly there and knock on the door, see what you find. So I go for my first reporting trip to Bahrain and run around all sorts of places, finding offices and traces of this company that didn't really quite exist. Mm-hmm. And so you need someone like that who is just going to back you to go and do the legwork.
But then as you kept pushing and delving deeper into it, I mean, you were, at least as you describe in your book, you know, a Wirecard has procured spies or sort of started the whole spying operation on you and even on your boss, Paul Marfio, an entire actually FT team. And then they were, you know, started sending, you know, legal summons, you know, lawyers, and all the sort of legal fees started adding up. I mean, it must have been pretty costly for the FT, you know, to actually keep supporting you in that. Which, how do you look at it from their sort of financial perspective?
The bills did get quite expensive. I mean, we ran up hundreds of thousands of pounds in legal costs. And the thing to understand is part of that is a fact of doing business, legal threats. And quite often it means you're on the right track. You know, if you're forcing them to respond with angry lawyers' letters, then that can mean we've got a pretty good story here and they're worried about it. The thing to understand is that Wirecard's great mistake was making it impossible for us to walk away. So what sort of develops is this cat and mouse battle between us and the company. And we go and do some reporting and we find evidence of fraud and then we publish it. And there's a moment, you know, we write the first big story and quite quickly 8 billion euros is knocked off Wirecard's stock market value. You know, it's a bit of a queasy feeling. Hope this story's right. But what Wirecard do is they respond by saying it's all nonsense, but also they say, I'm corrupt.
Okay.
That I'm working with stock market speculators to manipulate the share price. And regulators and the police should investigate me and my criminal friends. And for a while, that worked. I mean, the amazing thing is the amount of resources the German state threw into that investigation, into protecting the company because of this fear of stock market manipulation. But ultimately, it killed them because it made it impossible for the Financial Times to walk away from the story. They had called the reputation of the paper into question. You know, said they were giving over its pages to corrupt journalists. So from that moment on, the money didn't really matter anymore. You know, they were suing us in a Munich court, completely spurious. And we had to do all sorts of things, but really the only way through it all was to kill them, to expose the fact that they were the ones who were lying, that this was a giant fraud. So yeah, it was sort of, money was no longer an object.
And since you say that you actually had no other option but to pursue them until the very end, I mean, the end actually played out so quickly. The Wirecard was bust in a matter of days in June 2020. I mean, how did you feel?
I disagree with that, actually.
You do? Okay.
This is one of the things people say, oh yeah, Wirecard collapsed quickly. I'm like, no, it didn't. So I wrote the story in October 2019 that said, this is how they're committing fraud. Here are the names of all the customers which don't exist. This is how they are making up all their sales. And if you don't believe us, here are the documents which prove it. Mic drop. And there was enough evidence there that was all correct. It's all been shown to be it was all fake.
Okay.
But it took 8 months for the company to collapse because they were allowed to investigate themselves. You know, if a newspaper put on its front page, you know, there's evidence of drug dealing by someone, the police would knock down the door the next day, wouldn't they? You know, they would all move with a certain degree of speed. But because it's finance and it's complicated and no one really cares about esoteric financial crimes, the company gets the benefit of the doubt. It gets to hire another bunch of expensive advisors in the hope that it'll find a way to clear it all. So really, it took 8 months to collapse, during which time there was a whole lot of skullduggery and other crimes committed.
This is a really good way of looking at it, and I should actually be sort of thinking about it this way. But still, how much was Wirecard aided by the Germany's desire to have a tech champion? You know,
I think investors definitely got caught up in this idea of a new tech champion. And it is geopolitical these days, isn't it? This desire for companies which control so much of our life, have so much power, are building monopolies in very fundamental parts of society. So you can sort of understand why politicians in Europe thinking about, well, all our public interactions are on these websites owned by American billionaires. Every time we look for information online, 93% of searches or some ridiculous number go through Google. There is a very real concern about who is building the technological infrastructure that we use for our everyday communication. So, as well as sort of the great white hope, hey, we really want to have a successful stock market company, I think there are these sort of strategic imperatives that are encouraging people to say, we could really do with a stake in, the future of the global economy. And I think that did blind people to the idea that at last we've got a new European tech company.
Okay. But still, if I can sort of segue to this real character behind all that fraud at Wirecard, Mr. Jan Marszalek, and we actually, I'm sorry for actually, because his father, you would pronounce the S as Esh, because his father was of Czech origin, as you wrote in your book.
Oh, so how do you pronounce
Marszalek?
Marszalek.
What it actually really means is like a deputy marshal.
Oh.
So it is some sort of a army rank or officer rank. Anyway, he seems to be really the operator of the whole fraud behind Wirecard. Now, at large, he's been hiding since June 2020. And you've never actually met him, is that right? But your boss, Paul Murphy, didn't he? Can you tell us about Jan Marszalek yourself?
So Jan Marszalek, is that right?
Yeah, that would be right. Yeah,
close enough. Is the star of this story because he is the ultimate whiz kid. Drops out of high school, starts his own tech company, gets hired to join Wirecard, and sort of gets sucked into this world of financial crime. And at one level, he is a complete genius. They call him their chaotic genius inside the company. And he is the most charming guy you ever met. He can talk and talk, and he dresses better than anyone else. People fall in love with him when they meet him. I mean, his shirts cost $1,000 each, never mind the suits. And he is the guy who gets stuff done. And on the one hand, he is, incredibly good at it. But on the other hand, there's this sense of a kid who is out of his depth and is just making stuff up as he goes along, desperately improvising. And he keeps getting into these scrapes and just somehow getting out of them. And while he's doing that, he starts to make friends with guys in the Secret Service, former head of Libyan intelligence is hanging out at his villa. A Russian mercenary takes him on holiday to Syria to go and hang out with the boys from Wagner, who have just got rid of a bunch of ISIS fighters. So that's the kind of guy we're dealing with. And he's the one who behind the scenes just sort of manages to somehow charm his way from one thing to the next.
Yeah. I mean, he is almost like the real life sort of a weird version of Tom Cruise in some sort of a Mission Impossible, total weird remake.
It is incredible, isn't it? And it's one of the great enigmas is, who was he working for? Was he this chancer? You know, did he just happen to improvise his way into, you know, there's a moment where he's trying to raise a border force in Libya.
Yeah.
And it all falls apart. Nothing really happens. But at the same time, you know, it was quite scary. I've remembered as well. Now, you were asking me about the lunch. As I'm just banging on about what a fascinating character he is. And so to begin with, we haven't really heard of him. And then we start to realize he's the guy who's pushing back against us. And behind the scenes, we're trying to write stories and weird stuff keeps happening. Hackers are trying to break into our email accounts and various other people who've said nasty things about Wirecard. And private detectives are following people around. And we know enough about the company to realize it's deeply weird. There's something funny going on here. And then my boss, well, he knows some guys in the financial scene we call bandits, sort of rich businessmen who like to bet lots of money on the stock market and trade information, stuff like that. And this nightclub owner gets in touch and says, yeah, Jan Marszalek would really like to have lunch with you. And this idea of a $10 million bribe is raised if my boss can just make these stories about Wirecard disappear. And we never encountered anything like that. And I will admit, there was a moment where I think we went, that's a lot of money, you know. But I don't think we could really bring ourselves to think it's real. So we approached it as it was a trap. So my boss ends up having this lunch with Jan Marszalek, which is secretly recorded by some of our colleagues, sort of disguised as ladies who lunch with a camera and a handbag. And he has this dinner with Jan Marszalek, and he's as charming as ever, very businesslike in this one. And he does say some unusual things, like he had us checked out, that he'd been told we'd lived very ordinary lives. Mm-hmm. And again, that's quite an unusual thing for an executive at a financial institution to say.
So your book ends with him allegedly departing for Minsk, Belarus. Where do you think he has been hiding since that escape from
he flew
Austria?
From Vienna.
Yeah, like on a private jet.
Yeah, he goes to this little airfield, Bad Voslau, I think. I'm probably pronouncing it horribly, outside Vienna. Gets on a plane to Minsk and is never seen again. And some pretty grainy footage of someone who might be Jan emerged last year, I think outside a restaurant in Moscow. And various reports have put him in Russia, even at some specific addresses in the Moscow suburbs. So it does seem to be that somebody is protecting him. And there are suggestions that he has perhaps been used as a pawn by one of the Russian state security institutions, which was trying to broker some sort of meeting with the German Secret Service. Mm-hmm. Although they refused to take it, thinking that this was a trap, because given everything that's happened, sort of photographs of German spies meeting Jan Maslach probably would raise some interesting questions. So you can see why they didn't take the meeting. But what it boils down to is he's either got enough money or enough information that someone in Russia is protecting him. And that's the really interesting aspect of it, because they stole a lot of money. I mean, at least €1 billion was extracted from this company before it collapsed. Some of it in some very large loans to companies that would never pay them back. Some of it in supermarket carrier bags full of cash. A few €100,000 here, a few €100,000 there. But all the unanswered questions that were left behind about Wirecard, who was really behind it? Who was Jan really working with? What were the connections to secret services? Well, I think a lot of people breathed a little bit more easily when Jan disappeared.
Mm-hmm. You wrote the book summing up many years of your work as a journalist on actually uncovering this what actually seemed like an enigma than what he really understood, but now it's a plain, fraud. And then a deal with to do the documentary came up on Netflix. What was it about? How did it come about? Is it based on your book, or is it sort of a complementary material, or are you really branching out into filmmaking yourself?
The documentary is based on the book, but Paul Murphy and I were producers on the documentary as well. So we were very active in making it. And I think the reason it came about was twofold. One was people looked at the story and immediately thought, this is cinematic. All these crazy characters, these bizarre twists and turns. It's like a thriller. And we were determined to try and bring it to the biggest possible audience, because this was nothing like any story the Financial Times had covered before. And while it was happening, one of the things which kept us going was that sense of one day we're going to be able to tell this incredible story and people are not going to believe it. That sense of wait till you get a load of this. So what we really wanted to do was just try and bring a sense of all these crazy twists and turns in this adventure that we've been on, and just tell as many people as possible about it. And so a documentary with Netflix is one of the ways which you can reach people all over the world now. And one of the joys has been getting feedback from people all over the world who sort of send you a message going, holy mackerel, I just watched your film. What on earth was that? Wow.
But opting for a documentary, because as you said, and it's really reading the book, and I'm the kind of a guy who likes to read the book, then digest it, and then go to the documentary. So I still have to finish really watching it. And the reason is because I like reading, and I'm a Next reporter myself, but so I also like writing. But it is a thriller. The book is a thriller. But, period. Doesn't the documentary preclude you from actually writing a script for a feature movie?
No. The movie rights are still available. And so who knows? That's one of the great and fascinating challenges of the world, is how do you turn a story into a story on the silver screen? And I think that takes a very long time and an enormous amount of luck. But I think it's got the great ingredients for a thriller. So, if Tom Cruise is out there listening.
Yeah, well, so it could be another Wolf of Wall Street type of a movie about a financial fraud.
I think so. And Yeah, and I mean, speaking of the Wolf of Wall Street, there is a small cameo for Leonardo DiCaprio where he's hanging out with one of Jan Marsalek's best friends, and it's all too tortuous to go into here, but the son of one of the nightclub owners is hanging out with Leonardo DiCaprio and Jan Marsalek's friend. And that sort of is what glamours him into cooperating with the guys. And it's sort of, it's amazing. I don't know. We have this expression at the FT, which is all of our stories are connected. And please don't mean to understand that Leonardo DiCaprio is part of any of them. He's not. But it's these same characters keep popping up, and one story bleeds into another, and you find that there is just these interlocking worlds that you think are completely separate, and it turns out no, they're right next to each other.
Yeah, and the stories generate stories. They bring new stories to life. So what are you working on now, if you can tell us?
Well, I've got a story of widespread international corruption. One based on some
with
very
German flavor or not? With a German flavor?
No, not a German flavor on that one. There is a German element to another story I'm looking at, which is very accounting based and large amounts of debt, which could get quite interesting. But unfortunately, I can't name any names at the moment.
Says Dan McCrum. Thank you. It's been a great pleasure for us to talking to you, and good luck with all your work.
Thank you very much. It's been great chatting.